Okay, our first speaker, Fabio Lanza, is a cultural historian of 20th century China with a particular focus on political activism and urban space. He was born and bred in Venice, Italy, and moved to the United States in 1998. He teaches introductory courses on modern China and modern East Asia, as well as a course on communist China through films, memoirs, and fictional narratives. In all of Dr. Lanza's courses, he expands the reading list beyond what are usually considered historical sources to lead students to look at how history is continuously produced around us and to read everyday materials as potential archives. Professor Lanza.
Thanks, Albert. I'll try to be brief, and I'm gonna try to cover basically some U.S.-China relationship situation, this China-U.S.-China relationship situation today, and some of the problem it creates. Let me start with a series of article titles. Some from last few weeks, some from like last few months. Yeah, you have foreign affairs. You have the diplomat Brookings, and then you have, oh, sorry, this is before this. And then you have others. And it's a progressive descent from, if you want, the serious to the less serious, up to Senator Josh Hawley, who wants to ask China for reparation for the coronavirus. But I want to tell you that it's just a sample of a true onslaught of articles and opinion pieces from all sides of the Washington policy circles, nonchalantly deploying the concept of a new Cold War with the People's Republic of China. So these are not a few isolated voices, and this is not confined to some crazy right-wing or left-wing fringe. What we have now in Washington, D.C. is a consensus, a shared acceptance that a new Cold War with China is perhaps desirable, perhaps unwelcome, but definitely either already happening or pretty much unavoidable. I mean, this is very scary and very dangerous. So how do we get to this point? How did we get to this point? Well, the global pandemic, of course, played a major role, but I would argue it actually is an accelerant, not as a cause. This anti-China new Cold War rhetoric has a longer history, and Brett, later, my colleague Brett, will speak of the long and sordid history of anti-Asian racism in this country. So I won't touch that issue, but we can safely assume that ingrained anti-Asian prejudice plays a role in this. There's also the legacy of decades of blind anti-communism, which are layered over and over during the previous Cold War, the real one. But here I want to focus only on political developments of more recent times. But if you have questions about the longer anti-communist Cold War history, please ask them later. This has obviously to do mostly with the economic rise of China, now the second largest economic power in the world and slated to be the first one in a few years. This started, as probably you know, in the late 1970s with the program of reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, which built on the foundation of the previous Maoist period, but adopted what were basically capitalist policy and opened the country to foreign investment. And the development of China was indeed mind-boggling, has been indeed mind-boggling, skyrocketed in the 1990s, and leading to China officially entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. And at the time, the economic success of China was welcome in the US and in Western nation, more, I mean, I would say overwhelmingly welcome, because the US and Western nations saw China both as an almost unending sources of cheap labor and a potential market of over 1 billion customers. In the 1980s, the fear was of another Asian nation, Japan, which was seen as a competitor, not China. After 9/11, so after 2001, the US attention was focused on the so-called war on terror, and why the mutual dependence of the Chinese and American economy became more and more, more and more important and more significant. China remained, at least in terms of what is an adversary, peripheral. China was praised for its breakneck development speed, and while there were several instances of diplomatic frictions, the general sense was that it was always moving to become more and more like us, so to say. Well, things changed a little bit, or at least started to change a little bit with the Obama administration when they came to power, announcing a pivot to Asia. Obama claimed that he wanted to be the first Pacific president, and here you have Hillary Clinton article announcing America's Pacific century. The US then signaled at the time, so this is 2008, 2009, that they were willing to confront China so-called strategic dominance in Asia, whatever it was true or perceived, doesn't matter. This pivot actually truly really never happened for a bunch of reasons, but we can see here the first serious expression of a fear and the emergence of the US perception of China as a competitor. Then, alas, we have the Trump administration, and anti-China rhetoric did not just simply escalate, it exploded. Trump's rhetoric in China, like pretty much all his rhetoric, has been erratic, swinging widely from laudatory praise of laudatory comments about President Xi Jinping to announcement of a trade war, and even hints at the actual war. The pandemic, of course, sort of coupled this, and the administration has steadily deployed the specter of a treacherous China to deflect accusation of its own mismanagement and incompetence. Trump's discourse on China has taken tones incredibly more and more racist with reference to the China virus, the Kung flu, the Wuhan plague, and so on and so forth. I feel bad repeating this stuff, but sorry. Well, this is absolutely disgusting, and as I will explain later, very dangerous. This anti-China rhetoric is not exclusive to Trump or even to the Republican Party. In the presidential debate, in the first and maybe the only one we have, Joe Biden, while Trump had written The Art of the Deal, China had perfected the art of the steal. And the two camps have sparred on who would actually be tougher on China. When one party wants to discredit the other, to link it to China. You're weak on China, you're serving China, you favor China's interest. Again, there is a Washington consensus now, it goes beyond Trump, that China must be described as a competitor, an adversary, often as an enemy, and even an existential threat. The old vocabulary of the Cold War has been resurrected, and China is often depicted as red China, communist China, authoritarian, totalitarian, having perfected the electronic surveillance of its citizen, and potentially expanded its model of undemocratic rule to the rest of the world. Now, I will talk at the very end of my intervention about the very dangerous consequences of such a rhetoric. I want to clarify, sort of the reality behind this rhetoric, about the misleading ways in which China is discussed in the political discourse and in the public opinion here. And I think we should start with the reality we are now, the virus and the pandemic. Here it is. Oh, sorry. Here. My colleague and fellow historian, Andrew Liu, has written a couple of very good pieces. This one is in The Guardian, in the early months of the pandemic, and I will be make a reference to his work here. Especially in the first months of the pandemic, politicians in the US, and I would say journalists too, in the US and in the Western Europe, try very hard, and some are still trying, to blame China for the pandemic. The virus was supposedly the unique product of the appalling condition of China wet markets and Chinese people's insatiable craving for weird animal meats. They eat bats, they eat pangolins, they eat weird crap, and that's why we got the virus. This rhetoric directly and indirectly portray the Chinese, all of them, as undeveloped, dirty, uncivilized, and uneasily fascinated with strange exotic habits. Such a description of China is baffling to everybody who has spent any time in one of China's major cities, and Wuhan is one of China's major cities. It's also has very pernicious implication. Well, first and foremost, it relies on and reproduces the worst of racing and xenophobic and anti-Asian stereotypes but also because it obscures the actual condition under which this pandemic came to being and how it spread. So those of us who were around China and East Asia in 2003 or before 2003 were probably not that surprised when news of the Wuhan cases of coronavirus came out. We might have been horrified, we were horrified, but we're not that surprised. Precisely because in February 2003, the region was afflicted by the explosion of the so-called SARS epidemic, another coronavirus, this one more lethal, but much less transmittable. And since then, epidemiologists have warned us that another one, a worse one, was coming. MERS, which is the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, in 2012 came out exactly of the Middle East, but it was, again, more lethal, but much less spreadable. And it was not that one. It was not the big one that was coming. So this one is the one that we have been expecting for a while. And so the reason why maybe East Asian governments have been among the best and the fastest to react to the epidemic is precisely because, well, they kind of were expecting it. In Taiwan, Hong Kong, even Singapore, which are all, by the way, majority Chinese population place, but also South Korea, Japan, all reacted comparatively well. They were prepared and had developed good structure for public health. Even the People's Republic of China, for all its initial mistakes, has developed a response that is incomparably better than almost all Western states. Just recently, there were 12 cases in Qingdao, and the response was to test 9 million people in China, 9 million people out of 12 confirmed cases. So, despite all the delays and despite all the China blaming, we knew by January how dangerous this virus was. So for the US especially, but even for Western Europe, to blame China for the virus is just a way to excuse the inexcusable, given how much time we had to prepare, even compared to other European countries, to other Western countries, especially Europe. On the other hand, calling it the China virus means that this is something that can only happen to those people over there with a supposedly appalling living condition. And one could argue that this attitude probably fueled a Western exceptionalism that made the response to the virus slow and ineffective in the US and in Western Europe. This coronavirus, like all the other ones before it, emerges out of the so-called human-natural interface, in the increasingly narrow area connecting our urbanized lives with the so-called natural environment. And that connection has become increasingly closer because of the expansion of capitalism and because of climate change, which has brought that in increasing contact with animals and viruses. So even if one wanted to believe the crazy story of the Chinese exotic wild meat consumption, the illegal import of exotic animals has indeed increased in China, but this is largely because of the as a consequence of the emergence of a very rich elite class there, which can indulge in expensive taste. The large majority of the Chinese people do not consume anything like that and actually are against this largely illegal trade. And similarly, the spread of the pandemic followed the routes marked by the integration of China in the capitalist global market. And that includes the Wuhan, the very place where the virus sort of started, which is technically a second-tier city of 11 million people, but has been more closely absorbed in circuits of international trade as capital investment have moved away or moved inland from the coast of China in search of cheaper land and cheaper labor. In this sense, the virus has truly revealed the interconnectedness of the global capitalist economy at the time when many politicians, not only in this country, but around the world, are making obscene and absurd calls for border walls and immigration bans. So here we have another question. What is the position of China in this globalized capitalist world? So the Western discourse, the emerging Cold War discourse that depicts China still in Cold War terms as red, socialist, or communist, as strangely echoes some elements of the rhetoric deployed by the government of Xi Jinping within China. According to CCP current doctrine, the People's Republic of China is not a capitalist state. It pursues a supposedly different model, a model that's different from capitalism, which called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And the Xi government, the Xi Jinping government, stressed their continued adherence to the principle of Marxism and even Maoism. Now, the descriptions are often reproduced and cited by those elements in the Western left that want to see China as an alternative to the US and to Western capitalism. From a theoretical and practical standpoint, there is indeed much debate and very much doubt on whether the PRC, the People's Republic of China, is constructed in any way a socialist system. The state does maintain a crucial role in the economy, but that's not unique to China, and it is not enough to call anything socialist. And up until a few years ago, even economists of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences did not have qualms in defining the present economic structure of China as largely capitalist, even if with some differences. Anyway, we're not here to come to a final resolution on whether China is socialist or capitalist. What I want to highlight here is, once again, what the rhetoric on both sides, and very similar rhetoric on both sides, obscures, elides, and makes invisible. And that's the level to which the Chinese economy, however you want to define it, is profoundly enmeshed and intertwined with the global economy, specifically with the US economy. I'm following here an argument from another friend and colleague, Isabella Weber, who is an economist at UMass Amherst. This is a very recent piece again for The Guardian. In past decades, the development of a market-style economy in China and its increasingly close connection with the global network of production and trade in the West, again, was viewed positively as the path by which Chinese society and Chinese politics will transform to something more similar to us, capitalist, democratic, whatever. So the intimate connection between the PRC and the US, usually with the PRC in the role of the workshop of the war and the US in the role of the technological brain of the war, was supposed to prevent, this connection was supposed to prevent China from returning to isolation or developing in ways contradictory to the march of global capitalism. Now, when we're talking of a new Cold War, if you're talking about a new Cold War, it's precisely this mutual connection, this mutual integration that becomes the major issue. And in this context, both sides have been talking about the possibility, or rather the need to so-called decouple the two economies. In China, there's been a renewed push, and not only rhetorically, to replace foreign export with domestic consumption. At the next plenum of the CCP, of the Chinese Communist Party, which is opening like in a few days, Xi Jinping is expected to announce a new and sort of a twist, a shift in the economy with a new 5-year plan geared to change the direction of China, substituting precisely internal consumption for export and achieving self-sufficiency, especially in terms of technology. In the US, as you know, President Trump has threatened to decouple specifically from China. And while the Biden camp is slightly more cautious, they've also promised, quote, to reset the terms of economic and technology ties with China, end quote. Now, the word decoupling might sound like we are sort of detaching two, locked part, but neatly divided. That something that looks like a clean break is not only possible, but relatively easily achievable. That's not the case. The computer from which I'm using right now to talk to you was developed in California, built in China, in a Taiwanese factory, using mostly migrant Chinese labor. It is the embodiment of a global chain of production that's crisscrossed and ties together the entire world, but especially these two countries, China and the US. The coupling here means to reimagine and reinvent the entire chain, the entire global chain of production, something that took decades to develop. Just to give you an idea of the size, China today counts for 45% of the global production of computer and tablets. 45%, almost half of computer and tablets in the world. And China, on the other hand, while still making strides in developing its own know-how, still remains dependent on the US and the global markets for some fundamental technology, including computer chips. If you look at the financial sector, China still has the largest share of the foreign reserve of US dollars. Any idea of a financial war or a trade war becomes incredibly risky under this condition. The old Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US was between two powers whose economic systems were not only supposedly antithetical, but also largely independent. Here, not only the systems are actually very similar, but they're also incredibly connected, both to each other and to the global economy. So I've tried to sort of unpack a little bit how the anti-China rhetoric and the discourse of a new Cold War is based on a largely mistaken or false assumption about China and about the US-China relationship. The real problem is also that the rhetoric is not just wrong, it's also really, really dangerous at all levels. Let me start from the scariest stuff. A Cold War has always implied in it the potential to lead to an actual war. Recently, the Defense Department budget has been reconfigured to shift resources from the so-called war on terror to China. This is a defense budget. Empires need enemies, and the vague threat of terror worked for a while, but now there's clearly the need for something more substantial, and apparently China is this thing. And I don't think I need to explain how disastrous an actual US-China war could be. This rhetoric is also always very dangerous, as Albert was pointing out, for Asian America and for all Asian people who live in the US. There's been plenty of documented cases of racism and even violence against Asia, accused of spreading the plague or similar insanities. This rhetoric literally contributes to endanger the lives of actual people. It is also dangerous for our Chinese colleagues and for our Chinese students. We have so many of them in Arizona and in the US in general, and their contribution to the intellectual life of our institution and also to scholarship, technology, science, and learning in this country has been enormous in the last few years. Now we're talking about visas denial, students ban, generic accusation of espionage. This is chilling and terrifying. It is dangerous because it's damaging established paths of collaboration between people here and people in China. Even after the pandemic, if this continues, it's difficult to imagine we could go back and reestablish a relationship we had with colleagues in the People's Republic of China, or that those relationships could operate on similar patterns. And finally, again, it is dangerous because it prevents us to see problems clearly and to act on them in China and in the US. The rhetoric that demonizes China in the US and in the Western world is not just bad in itself. It makes understanding what's going on in China and the world more difficult. For example, any expansion of China's capital in other regions of the world, Africa, Latin America, for example, is depicted as an act of Chinese imperialism, even when the Chinese government is not really that keen or interested in spreading its own model of governments there. Now, we might actually be witnessing some new forms of imperialism. We might not. We might in some cases and not in others. But the fact that every action of the PRC is portrayed in uniformly nefarious way does not help us to understand what's going on. Even the bad stuff that's going on. More importantly, the flattening nature of this overarching and largely stupid new Cold War discourse makes it way more difficult to criticize the Chinese government and to act on the Chinese government for undeniably bad things they have done and continues to do. The obvious case is the internment of hundreds of thousands of people of Uyghur ethnicity in Xinjiang, which is well documented and truly horrifying, and should indeed be singled out for criticism and sanction. But the criticism loses much of its efficacy when it comes from people like Marco Rubio or others who are ready to demonize China from pretty much anything, no matter how far-fetched, and who have been persistently silent when the US has engaged in acts of similar ferocity against Muslims or immigrants. Indeed, this anti-China rhetoric makes it difficult to understand the perverse logic that leads to the internment of people in cages, be it Xinjiang, Guantanamo, or the Mexico border. That logic, which is, by the way, grounded on the very trope of the war of terror, here as in China, is not exclusive to one specific system, but it is indeed a product of rampant nationalism at the moment, of crisis of capitalism, and of rabid anti-Muslim racism that is truly part of a global phenomenon. Now, I don't know how to conclude this. I conclude with this, with some other scholars of China, including the two I cited earlier, Andrew Liu and Isabella Weber. We have organized a group called the Critical China Scholar, and you can see here parts of our statement of purpose. As you can see, our goal is to provide an alternative to the dominant rhetoric on China and US-China relationship, refusing both the demonization of China, refusing the demonization of China while highlighting how the Chinese state also oppressed some of its citizens. I leave it this as sort of a different approach to the one that is dominant now in the public opinion, and I hope that you'll have questions, and I'm happy to answer any of them.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lanza.